My name's Nancy Ockenden. I'm the science manager on the programme. And I think we've got a few people here who are not from within the programme. So just to quickly say a few words about the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes programme. So we're primarily a grant-making organisation focused on restoring natural ecological processes across land and seascapes. And that's with the aim of building and enhancing species populations, habitats, to really benefit nature, to benefit people, and to benefit climate. So primarily what we do is fund large-scale ecosystem restoration projects on the ground. But as well as that, we also fund smaller grants, which are used for projects which are addressing barriers to ecosystem restoration. So these can be kind of technical barriers, policy-related barriers, or societal changes. And in today's webinar, we're going to hear from one of these projects that's just coming towards the end of its work. It's a project that's been led by researchers at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Cambridge. We've got Janet Fisher here, who's one of the co-leads, along with Chris Sambrook. Hi, Janet. And the project's been addressing an issue that's really of critical importance in a lot of large-scale restoration projects, which is how to build partnerships across organisations. So partnerships in restoration projects may involve a really broad range of organisations, and those organisations likely have differences in the way they're structured, in their perspectives and in their values, and what they may be wanting to get out of a project. So this project was really wanting to help particularly sort of new and developing ecosystem restoration projects build stronger partnerships by developing a process which really kind of lays out and clarifies partners' perspectives and allows them to kind of discuss and deliberate any differences that arise. So it's probably unrealistic to expect partners to agree on everything, but I think it could make a real difference if those differences are made really transparent and are discussed early on in the process of setting up a partnership. So today we're going to hear from Annette Green, who's a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh, who's been working on this project and specifically developing a toolkit to improve how we understand different perspectives among project partners. And Annette's particularly been working with one of our projects, one of our landscape restoration projects in the Lake District to develop and test this toolkit. And that landscape's got a partnership that's involving conservation NGOs, utility companies, private estates, and farming communities. So that's a really complex and knotty context to be working in. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it. So I'll hand over to you, Annette. Thank you.
Right, so afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining, and thank you, Nancy, for that introduction. As Nancy explained, I'm the postdoctoral researcher on this project, the Restoration Partnership Development Project, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit and about using tools from social sciences to build partnerships for landscape restoration. So this is the structure of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. I'll start by talking about restoration and contestation in the UK and the rationale underpinning the work that I've been doing with Janet Fisher. I'll secondly talk about the Restoration Partnership Development Project, its overall aim and its relationship to other projects. I'm going to talk about mine and Janet's experiences of using social science tools for restoration with reference to a specific case study in Cumbria, as Nancy mentioned. And I'll talk about designing and delivering a survey for stakeholder perspective elicitation and designing and delivering a workshop for stakeholder perspective deliberation. And I'll also be talking about how others can use this toolkit in the future as well. And just to make a quick note as well on what Nancy spoke about, building partnerships between different organisations that come into partnership together, that is a big part of what our work does, but we also haven't expanded. We want to expand that collaboration to the wider stakeholders as well. So we're talking about discussing and better understanding stakeholders, not only between different partner organisations, but also the wider stakeholders they're working with. So yeah, go on to talk about restoration and contestation in the UK and the rationale underpinning the work that me and Janet have been doing. In this set of images, I've tried to capture some of the ways in which people think about or relate to nature or natural spaces in the UK. So some people engage with nature for leisure or outdoor pursuits, like these cyclists or people that go glamping in nice pods like this in the Lake District. These are occasional visitors. They have particular wants and needs from the spaces that they're engaging with. And then you might have people, maybe people who are more like the people in the audience today, who maybe have professional backgrounds and are therefore motivated mainly by restoration and conservation concerns. So maybe they want to preserve spaces like the Cambridgeshire Fens, like in this photo for the specific habitat, or ancient English woodlands, like in the centre of this collage, for either the habitat or species, or for some kind of cultural value that's ascribed to these spaces, so motivated by restoration or protection. And you've got different people who are represented by these grouse moor shooters here, who are in Scotland, I think. Or maybe like this kind of scene. It's on the front of the book The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks, which shows maybe the most quintessential countryside landscape, a sheepdog herding sheep in upland fells in somewhere in England. So all of this is effectively to say that there's lots of different ideas and beliefs about natural spaces in the UK. And these ideas and beliefs, so people's perspectives, are shaped by their identities and values, the kind of people they are, whether they're occasional visitors, whether they're people who are motivated by restoration, whether they're people who live and work in these landscapes every day and for whom their identities and livelihoods are very much, so whom their identities are tied up with their livelihoods and what they do in these landscapes. And then at the same time, you've also got increasing, because of like ongoing climate catastrophe and catastrophic biodiversity loss, there's increasing demands that are being placed on top of these kind of rural or natural spaces in the UK. So in the top right-hand corner, you've got this screenshot of different tree planting pledges from political parties in the election 2019. Tree planting requires a change in the way we manage land and what we use the land for and what we expect from it. Similarly, there's increasing concerns about energy, making energy renewable, securing energy for this country. Again, that's a different demand that we're placing on the land, a new expectation from it. And then this is just a really small clipping from a very tiny part of the expansive sculpture review, which makes reference to the need for better management of land and sea to benefit both nature and people. So that's just a few words, but there's a lot contained within this very short snippet. This is a big ask, to manage land differently, to manage it better, to benefit nature and people, so to achieve ecological and social objectives. So yeah, increasing demands on land management in the UK and an accompanying increasing sense of urgency because of biodiversity loss and climate change. And it's for this reason that many partnerships involving different interests are being convened to achieve that landscape change, to make that landscape change happen, to come up with different management plans so that we can reach ecological and social objectives from the land that we have. So these are just two examples, you know, plucked more or less at random. So you've got Highlands Rewilding is an example of a partnership which has a landscape vision under the banner of rewilding of how land should be managed. Another partnership, but a very different kind, would be the partnerships that will be convened over coming years in the development of local nature recovery strategies. So this is part of a government directive that says that the entirety of England needs to be covered by some kind of spatial plan for local nature recovery, and they're going to need to be delivered primarily by local councils, and they will have to convene partnerships and speak to a lot of different stakeholders in order to achieve that. So all of this is basically to convey, we've got a lot of different people, a lot of different ideas about land management, a lot of different motivations. Yeah, a lot of different stakeholders with different perspectives. It's a complex situation. It's a very noisy situation. We want to develop social science-based tools for eliciting and deliberating stakeholder perspectives on land management, so the kind of people who I've tried to capture in this collage in the background. And that's because we believe that better understanding of stakeholder perspectives will make restoration projects better and fairer. So let's talk a bit about that. Why do we think that exploring and understanding stakeholder perspectives can make restoration projects better and fairer? I think firstly there's an intuitive answer to that. Maybe Nancy alluded to a little bit in her introduction there. Intuitively, it makes sense that if we have more information about what partners and what stakeholders think about restoration, about land management, that's going to be really helpful information for a restoration project. And also inclusion of different stakeholders is going to make the project more fair. So they're quite uncontroversial things to say that intuitively make sense. But in addition to that, there is a basis in scholarship for making this claim that, you know, this motivation for Janet and I to use social science tools and our belief that it can make restoration projects better and fairer. And that comes from scholarship on like conflict and disagreement and contestation in conservation. And there's some new-ish scholarship coming out that tries to conceptualize conflict in a slightly different way, and which effectively says that conflict in conservation often stems from unmet psychological or emotional needs. So it's almost like alluding to what Nancy said in the introduction, this idea that it's very likely that people are going to disagree about things, especially when they're coming into partnership with each other. And when you try to run a project that involves a lot of different stakeholders, it's less the disagreement that's an issue, or that it's less a disagreement that leads to conflict, and it's more that the conflict emerges from something that's more deep-rooted to do with people's psychological and emotional needs not being met. So what do we mean by that? So this is a quotation from a paper from Madden and McQuinn from 2014, Conservation's Blind Spot, the Case for Conflict Transformation in Wildlife Conservation. And they say in the paper, conservation conflicts often serve as proxies for conflicts over more fundamental, non-material, social and psychological unmet needs, including status and recognition, dignity and respect, empowerment, freedom, voice and control, which are not addressed by technical fixes or approaches. So this is a long quotation. What it's effectively getting at is, you know, there's something in here about making all your stakeholders, letting them know that they're heard, making them feel heard, seen, giving them recognition, meeting an emotional or a psychological need that they have. And the idea that this has value, but meeting this need has value in helping to circumvent the possibility of emerging conflict as your restoration project progresses. So really, it's a pretty simple concept that this project is based on, and it's the idea that we can take a survey that will help us understand stakeholder perspectives first off, and then following that, we can build deliberative workshop. We can use the data emerging from the survey to build deliberative workshops. So you use that data to make the workshops. You use the survey to elicit the perspectives, and then you use the workshops to discuss those perspectives productively, make them open, make them explicit. So what do we think we can achieve? We propose that if we use a survey for perspective elicitation plus the workshop for perspective deliberation, this can address psychological and emotional needs to be heard, seen, recognised. We believe that it can encourage consideration of others' perspectives, so enhance mutual understanding, and foster a sense of openness and curiosity between stakeholder groups who might assume that they would otherwise be at odds, so building trust between them. This is what we think we can achieve with social science tools, and specifically using this dual survey and workshop approach. So that was just a bit about, you know, the rationale, the motivation for doing this work and the rationale underpinning it. I'll talk a bit now about the Restoration Partnership Development Project, its kind of overall aim and its relationship to other projects. So Janet, the PI on this project, is involved in gathering empirical data from 4 different restoration partnership case studies. So There's one in the Northern Scottish Highlands, one in the Central Scottish Highlands, one in Cumbria and one in Shropshire. And each of these case studies is generating empirical data to support 2 projects. So the Northern Highlands and the Central Scottish Highlands case studies are contributing empirical data to a different project that Janet is PI on called Mapping and Deliberating Values for Uplands Management, or MADAVU. And then the Cumbria case study and the Shropshire case study are contributing empirical data to the Restoration Partnership Development Project, which is this project that I'm employed by. And then the findings and lessons from both of these projects, MADAVU and RPD, are contributing to the final output, which is going to be the Toolkit for Mapping and Deliberating Restoration Project Stakeholder Perspectives. That's a mouthful. We might need to come up with something snappier than that. But for now, that's the most succinct way of saying what the final aim is of these projects and all of this empirical data. And the toolkit's going to comprise the adaptable statement-based survey tool, plus self-guided materials and training materials on using the survey tool and using the data from the survey to structure workshops. Okay, so that's an overview of the work that we're doing. So yeah, I'm the postdoc on this project. So I only have experience of working within RPD, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And specifically today, I'll be talking about our experiences of working in Cumbria. Yeah, so experiences of using social science tools for restoration. In the Cumbria case study, I'm going to talk about designing and delivering a survey for stakeholder perspective elicitation in Cumbria. Cumbria Connect is the name of our case study. It's an ELSP restoration landscape project. It's based in Eastern Cumbria around Haweswater, for anyone that's familiar with that area. RSPB are the project lead. They're working alongside Natural England, United Utilities, who are the water provider for the Northwest, and Lowther Estate, which is a major private landowner. And the project is focused on the restoration of 33,000 hectares of English upland landscape. So that's what this project is about. Landscape scale, large scale. Farmers are the major stakeholder group in this project. A lot of farmers around there, as you can imagine. And the way in which Cumbria Connect wants to engage with farmers is through this question: how can Cumbria Connect help farmers navigate change and or benefit from nature restoration? So in terms of their engagement with the stakeholder group and that element of their project, that's how they're doing it. How can they help farmers navigate change or benefit from nature restoration? So that's Cumbria Connect's motivation for wanting to better understand their stakeholders' perspectives on land management. Yeah, and then this slide is really just to demonstrate to you, it's kind of just a collage to demonstrate that this is really a particularly rich landscape to work in for a project that wants to explore different and sometimes competing stakeholder perspectives. There's a lot going on here, culturally, ecologically, historically, as well as all of the usual kind of countryside-y issues of like what's going to happen to farmers post-Brexit, and changes to how government supports or doesn't support farmers, agri-environment schemes, changing farming livelihoods, the average age of farmers increasing, changing working patterns in the wake of the pandemic, all of that usual stuff. Plus you've got some stuff that's really specific to Cumbria. So you've got Herdwick sheep here. It's a big debate over tradition, the preservation of farming tradition in this part of Cumbria as a cultural asset. George Monbiot has written a lot about this. It's probably the most well-known example of what people say about sheep in the Lake District from a restoration perspective. He argues that the Lake District's World Heritage Site is a betrayal of the living world. And then in contrast, you have rebuttals from farmers and shepherds like Andrew Meanwell, who say, as a shepherd, I know we haven't sheep-wrecked Britain's landscape, and families like mine have made this landscape. We've maintained a delicate ecosystem here. So it's really complicated. It can be really divisive. It can be quite heated. And there might be some people in the audience who've already read While Fell by Lee Schofield, but it's a really great book if you want to very quickly and in a really interesting way become familiar with a lot of these different issues. So yeah, it's a very, very rich text. It's a great place to work on researching stakeholder perspectives and disagreements that emerge from that. So as I said, we've got this dual approach. We decided that we wanted to build a survey that would deliver data that would be useful for structuring workshop activities. That's the approach that we decided we wanted to take. And it meant that the survey had some quite specific requirements when we were building it that might be a bit different from surveys that you've participated in or even built. You know, the first thing was that the survey needed to generate data that would help foster productive conversations in stakeholder workshops. That's what we were building this survey for, and not as a standalone tool for data collection. The survey needed to be short, it needed to be online for ease of delivery, simple format. And really importantly, it needed to be usable eventually independently by non-social scientists. So it needed to be quite intuitive to use and not really requiring any specialist expertise or skills in social science. So from these requirements, we decided that we would make the survey Likert-based because it's a format that a lot of people are familiar with. I'm sure all of you will have done a survey like this at some point, where the respondent is presented with a survey and then they're asked to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement with that survey. So this is what Likert scale surveys look like. And then once we decided that the survey was going to be Likert based, we had to go about generating the statements for the survey. And they needed to be statements that would adequately capture the most salient issues on restoration and land management in the landscape we were working in, so in this Eastern Cumbrian landscape. In doing that, I collected data from primary data from interviews. So I interviewed farmers primarily, different kinds of farmers, upland farmers, dairy farmers, mixed farmers, who are all stakeholders in the Cumbria Connect landscape in some capacity. And I also interviewed a couple of people from heritage organisations and a couple of people who are involved in private businesses in the area. So that was my primary data. And then I did a literature review to using a lot of secondary data. So I tried to learn as much as I could about the Cumbria Connect project. I was reading a lot of news articles, familiarising myself with the kind of post-Brexit landscape and how that might affect upland farmers specifically, changes to agri-environment schemes, this ongoing debate between George Monbiot and sheep farmers, a lot of blogs, comment sections, academic literature, this book by Lee Schofield. So really, through this primary data and secondary data, I was just trying to immerse myself in this really complex context. And once I'd done that, I had to kind of take this whole mess of the discourse surrounding land management in this really complex area, the primary data and all of the secondary data, and put it through a process of a kind of distillation. So I initially produced a list of maybe like 100 plus statements. It was definitely over 100 statements, and go through a process of refinement, distillation, culling statements, editing statements, rewriting statements, so that we would eventually end up with just 30 statements about what we thought were the most salient issues in restoration and land management in the Cumbria Connect landscape. I didn't do that on my own. I did that in collaboration with Janet and with our colleague Chris Sambrook at Cambridge. And collectively, we all have a fair bit of experience of building statement-based research tools like this. And Janet and Chris's experience in that stems largely from the Future of Conservation survey, which some of you may be aware of, some of you may have done. And Janet is here, so she can talk more to that if that's relevant. But yeah, collectively, we had a lot of experience of building surveys that were based on statements somehow in this way. And we wanted the statements that we used to cover 6 themes, we made sure that they covered these 6 themes. So farming, nature, restoration, people, community and culture, landscapes, and governance and decision making. And these are all big themes. They're not discrete, they overlap. Really, this was mainly, we used these themes to make sure that we were covering a really broad range of issues in the 30 statements that we ultimately selected for the tool, for the survey tool. This is an example statement from the Likert-based survey. So this is how it was presented to the participants online using Microsoft Forms. So the statement is, I would like to see more diverse tree species in the landscape, and you can see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different categories of agreement that the respondents can select. So they did this for all 30 statements. We had 49 respondents, and we collected, so the survey was anonymous, and we didn't collect any personally identifying data, but we wanted, or we needed to collect data on their professional backgrounds, because that was the only way that we could know in an anonymous survey that we were collecting data from people across all the categories of stakeholders in this landscape. So farming, conservation, heritage, and then estate or land management. So that was why we collected that data. And you might be thinking 49 is maybe a small number for a survey. So I'll speak a little bit about the sampling and our sampling strategy. The sampling was highly targeted. So that included me sending emails, forwarding the survey to people via their individual email accounts and saying you would be a good candidate to do this survey, sometimes calling people to prompt them. We couldn't send it out en masse to collect loads of responses, because we needed to make sure that we were collecting responses from people who were actually stakeholders in the Cumbria Connect landscape. In our sample, we included people from the constituent organisations of Cumbria Connect, as well as the wider stakeholders from all of these stakeholder groups listed down the side here. And it's not a representative sample. We didn't build a survey to be representative. We weren't aiming for that. We're not claiming to make any inferences about the entire population of stakeholders in the Cumbria Connect landscape. What we were aiming for is diversity. So we were sampling for diversity of perspective and not representation. That's really important to remember. And that's why we needed to make sure that we were collecting this little bit of data on people's professional backgrounds, because we were using that as a kind of proxy for diversity of perspective. This is an example survey result from just one statement. So all of the 49 responses to each of the 30 statements produced a visual like this, showing the proportions, how people responded proportionally to the different categories of agreement. So this is the statement, it's important to me that this landscape helps provide clean and safe water. You can see here that, in fact, no one disagreed with the statement. We don't have any disagree or disagree strongly, orange or red on this side. And most people, in fact, agreed with the statement or agreed strongly with it. If you compare this to this statement, I am concerned that there will no longer be a place for me in this landscape if it changes too much. This is an example of a statement where we have a wide spread of responses across all 5 categories of agreement. So all of the 5 categories are represented here fairly evenly. And you can really see that if you place these 2 statements side by side, like I have done here, you can see visually that there's been very different responses to these statements. But as well as just kind of eyeballing the data through these visuals that were produced for each statement, we also calculated a consensus index score for each statement, based on the responses from the 49 participants. So the consensus index score would be between 1 and 0. So you can see the top statement about clean and safe water produced a relatively high consensus index score of 0.798. It was one of the highest scores, or maybe the highest score that we had for this survey. And then the lower statement about not concerned whether there would be a place in this landscape if it changes, whether there would be a place for me in this landscape if it changes. The consensus index score for that was low. It's one of our lowest scores at 0.368. So we were using these consensus index scores as a kind of indication of issues that we thought people would be more likely to be able, that stakeholders would be able to find common ground on. And those issues that we thought they would be less likely to be able to find common ground on, those issues that we thought would be more divisive. So we used a consensus index score for that purpose, and we had a consensus index score for all 30 statements. I'm not going to show you all 30 statements and the results accompanying them, because that would be way too overwhelming, but I can show you some examples of statements where we thought there was quite a high level of consensus and where we therefore anticipated people would be able to find common ground with statements like these ones. So there's the one about safe and clean water, which I already discussed. Farms in this landscape can be part of the solution for tackling biodiversity loss, and this landscape can and should make a contribution to domestic food security. So these statements elicited a high level of consensus across all the stakeholders, and with most people agreeing with these statements. Whereas these were the divisive statements. We've already gone through this one, the example, I'm concerned that there will no longer be a place for me in this landscape if it changes too much, was a divisive statement. When looking after nature, the knowledge of locals is more valuable than scientific evidence. That was a divisive statement. And similarly, it's important to me that this landscape looks neat and tidy. People responded across all 5 categories of agreement for these statements. I'll speak a little bit now about designing and delivering the workshop for stakeholder perspective deliberation based on the results of this survey. We did 2 deliberative stakeholder workshops, one on the 1st and one on the 2nd of August this year, evening sessions in Bampton Memorial Hall. That's me there. At the workshops, we've had attendees from Cumbria Connect constituent organisations. So we had representation from Cumbria Connect in the room as participants in this process, plus the wider stakeholders from across these groups that I mentioned: farming, restoration, heritage and estate management. We had an introduction from an independent facilitator who we hired specifically to help us with these workshops. There was a short presentation from someone from Cumbria Connect, and then a short presentation from me on interpreting survey data results. I just showed example statements like I have done with you guys just now. And in my presentation, I emphasised that what we were wanting from the participants was for them to help us understand the survey results. So I wasn't showing them my interpretation or my analysis. I was just helping them to kind of get their heads around dealing with this kind of data, and then inviting them to help us understand the data. And we did that in small group activities based on survey results. What were those activities? Well, first we asked participants in their small groups, which Janet and I predetermined and put them into. We asked them to consider overall survey results on individual handouts that we printed and gave out. And we asked them to think about which survey results they found particularly surprising and which were unsurprising. So this was a really useful way just to help people dig into the data a little bit and get to grips with it. Secondly, there was then a round of in-depth discussions, again in the small groups, of pre-selected individual statements. So Janet and I selected statements based on the results of the survey that we wanted people to discuss in their small groups. So each group was provided with one statement with a high level of consensus and asked to consider why they thought there was a high level of consensus on that issue and what the barriers might be to making positive changes with regards to that issue. So if there's a high level of consensus on it, is there anything stopping us from making positive changes? And then each group was provided with 3 statements with a low level of consensus and asked to consider why respondents might have such different perspectives on that issue and what challenges might arise from people not agreeing with each other about it. And really, we designed these exercises Oh, it says major. That should say a major objective of the small group exercises was to get participants to think from someone else's perspective and reflect on their own. So that was what we were really trying to get people to do. That's why we designed the exercises as we did. And then the final workshop activity was a plenary discussion where we asked people, if we are to work better together to benefit everyone who cares about this place, what areas should we focus on? And people were really kind of forthcoming with ideas about that. They were really warmed up by that point. They had a long time to reflect on their own, on the results of the survey. And yeah, it was great. It seemed to go really well. We asked for feedback from the workshop participants more or less there and then. We provided them with paper feedback forms. And the kind of thing that participants said on those feedback forms, some examples, people spoke about opportunity to unpack controversial issues, great. Get under the skin about what others' concerns, issues, worries are. Opportunity to get my views out there. Helps to understand the way we obviously see things completely different at times. Allowing me to appreciate where others are coming from. And non-confrontational. So these are just examples and snippets that I took from the feedback forms. And I think if you think back towards the beginning of this presentation where I spoke about how we wanted to use social science tools to help address unmet psychological needs about feeling heard and feeling seen and feeling recognized, this is exactly the kind of feedback that we wanted to see. And again, we also had that aim of trying to get people to see things from someone else's perspective, maybe to subvert their expectations of other people who they might have considered to be adversaries or to have completely different perspectives from them. And this sense of building trust and mutual understanding between people. In that respect, we were really happy to get this kind of feedback from the participants. I've made a little sticker here that says independent facilitation because we think that was really key in making these workshops successful and running well. Janet and I were independent. We were from the University of Edinburgh. We were the ones that convened this workshop, but we didn't have any skin in the game with Cumbria Connect per se. And that seemed to help quite a lot. Similarly, we employed a specialist, like an independent facilitator who again didn't have anything to do with the Cumbria Connect project to come and help run the workshops. That people seem to really enjoy that and appreciate that we did that. And then there's the use of third object theory. So this is something that I just wanted to mention. It's something that's mainly from education and psychology scholarship, and specifically about working with children. And it's an idea that you can introduce an object into conversation-based research, and it can make potentially difficult conversations a little bit easier. So that's the idea. And we kind of applied that in a group setting conversation using the survey data as the third object. And that seemed to work really well as well. So it meant that, again, people who might see the person sitting opposite them as their adversary in any other situation, they weren't focusing so much on each other. And it got them out of a pattern of defending their own view or attacking someone else's, and they were talking through the survey results instead. So to that extent, the third object theory of making potentially difficult conversations easier, that seems to really work quite well as well. Okay, I've got a few minutes left to go. So how can others use this toolkit? It will be available for other people to use, yes. It's being developed at the moment, and it's going to be app-based across 3 apps. So app 1 is where the user, so the practitioner or the project leader, can build their own bespoke survey. So it will be like at scale with a certain set of statements, but it won't be identical to the survey that we did in Cumbria Connect. It will have a different set of statements. From app 1, this app one effectively builds app two, builds a survey in app two where respondents, so the project stakeholders, can do the survey. So this is where they do the Likert scale survey. And then from app two, app three is where the user, again, so the practitioner or the project leader, will be able to see the results of the survey, and they'll look like this. They'll look like the visualizations that I showed you with all the different colors representing different categories of agreement, and they'll also show consensus index scores as well. So that's how the tool is going to be used. The survey is going to be usable across the 3 apps. Just a word on building your own bespoke survey. So that's going to be because the user will be able to choose from predetermined banks of statements categorized by context or project type. So we're still working on that. And we're also considering maybe the possibility for users to create their own statements, but that probably requires quite a lot more thought from Janet and I. And also just to say that there will be supporting materials that will include guidance on statement selection, stakeholder identification, sampling, data interpretation, and then using the data to convene workshops. So that will all of that advice and guidance will be available in supporting materials that will go with the app. This is the last slide now, so we just want to leave you with this. So what really, what do we think that this toolkit can achieve? Well, firstly, there's the instrumental function of generating indicative data on where restoration partnership stakeholders and restoration partnership organisations may agree and disagree. So that's data that's generated from the survey. It's data that is useful. But importantly, in addition to that, it has the experiential function of enhancing mutual understanding, building trust between different kinds of stakeholders, and that's from the workshop. So that's why the workshop and the survey approach have to go together. It's this dual approach to deliver both the instrumental and the experiential objectives. And where do we think the toolkit might be used? Any projects involving land management, really. At any stage where learning about stakeholder perspectives would be useful, which is any stage really, but most likely at the early stages. And in projects where it would help to build mutual trust and enhance understanding between different stakeholder groups. Again, that could be any project really, but it might be particularly useful in landscapes that have historically had a bit of contention or disagreement, as had been the case in the landscape we were working in Cumbria. And just to say, Janet and I, we're always open to hearing people's ideas about where they think this tool or this kind of approach might be useful in their work. We had someone after the Bampton workshops approach us about using this tool maybe in the development of local nature recovery strategies. That's something we're kind of thinking about at the moment. So we're always really happy to hear about that. And that is it from me. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was interesting and helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Annette. That was really clear and really interesting. It sounds like a fascinating process you went through with the Cumbria stakeholders. So really interesting to see some snippets of what you were getting there. And yeah, as you say, it'd be great when all those resources are available, which will be through the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes programme website in due course. But we've got a few minutes for questions. So if people have questions for Annette, do stick your hand up now. I had quite a lot of questions, most of which you answered in that last phase about how you can apply the tool in other landscapes. Does anybody else have any questions? Either stick your hand up or put it in the chat. So an easy one in the chat, well, maybe easy, simple, which is when do you think the tool will be available?
We hope relatively soon, and Janet is in the audience, so she might also be able to give a bit more of an indication of how we're progressing on these timelines. I'm only going to be with this project towards the end, until the end of December, so it ought to be before then. We also had a little bit of a setback because someone that was helping us with the app development hasn't been able to work for a little while, so that's delayed things a while. But I would say over the coming months, once we've ironed out some of these questions that we have about how exactly we think it's going to work with users being able to draw down on banks of statements, pulling together some of the empirical findings from the other 3 case studies that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So, you know, making sure that we use the findings from the Scottish Highlands and from Shropshire, which are really different kind of landscapes from the one in Cumbria. And then also reaching a decision about whether we think it would be useful and, you know, practicable to allow users to make their own statements as well. I think we're quite in 2 minds about that. Yeah, so we need to think about it. And I can see Janet's just said in the chat that she thinks it'll certainly be available by January.
I can't see any hands up at the moment. Oh, well, and if you'd like to ask your own question, please do. But Alex has asked, how much will it be to use the app in a bespoke way? I mean, I can speak from the program's point of view that the app will definitely be freely available. I don't know if there's any plan to make anything more customized than that.
Yeah, no, the plan is for it to be freely available for people to use, and it should be low cost because, you know, the app will be freely available, the guiding materials are going to be freely available. There won't be any kind of extra costs or anything to make the survey bespoke. That's all going to be built in as part of the project. The thing that might cost people money would be the use of an independent facilitator. So Janet and I did speak about this a couple of times because we do feel quite strongly that that really, really, really helps, especially if you're the organisation that's trying to find out stakeholder perspectives in order to make your restoration project better. Having someone independent to convene the workshops goes a really long way. It has a lot of symbolic value. It also means that people from your organisation or from other partner organisations that are involved in whatever your landscape restoration project is can be in the workshop as participants. Again, that's the approach that we took in Cumbria, and again, it had a really significant symbolic value. It seemed to go a long way, especially with farmers who made remarks afterwards about how they'd had their expectations of certain people completely subverted. You know, they would see the name of a particular organisation on a name badge and would make assumptions about what that person would say and what would motivate them. And in the event, it turned out to be quite different from what they expected. So yeah, don't underestimate the value of allowing people from your organisation to be part of this as participants as well. But yeah, so getting an independent facilitator is really helpful, but that's the bit that costs the most money, really.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but useful to sort of be aware of that up front.
Yeah.
Got a question from David Thomas, which I can read out for him. He's asked, how did you decide the stakeholder groups that you wanted to solicit responses from? So, for example, local businesses weren't included in that. So how did you identify the key stakeholders?
I guess it needed to be people who were, let's say, more or less actively involved in land management, which people who, something like people who have campsites, for example, that's a bit of a grey area because that kind of is land management in a way, but petrol stations or local shops and stuff, that's not decision making that affects how the land is used in that direct way that you might get from, for example, a farmer. So as I said, they were the major stakeholder group, so they had to be included. And then the other major groups would be, again, people who were involved in restoration or conservation in some way. They were mainly people who were involved directly in the Cumbria Connect project, in fact. So these are people who can influence the way that land is managed. So maybe not, you know, they might not necessarily be going out and digging up the land or choosing what livestock goes onto the land, but they have a lot of influence because they have these funded restoration projects which will change how land is managed. So they had to be included. And then similarly for people who were representatives from like cultural and heritage organisations as well, organisations like Friends of the Lake District or National Trust. Again, these are influential organisations where people are involved in land management decision-making processes already anyway. And the things that they say are, yeah, highly influential and can affect changes on the ground. So that was how we selected those stakeholder groups. The people that I did speak to that were involved in private businesses were, actually, I'm not sure that I can really describe who they were without compromising their anonymity. So I'll take that back. But I did speak to a couple of people who had private business interest in the area. But yeah, I won't say any more than that. But otherwise, it really had to be people that were involved in land management actively or influencing it to a certain level. Yeah.
Yeah, which I guess makes sense as the kind of extension from the partnership. It's the people, as you say, with the influence and the decision making that you're involving. It's not the community engagement, which is a different piece of work. And I can see one more question in the chat from Alex in Sabuco in Georgia. He's asked about key considerations in terms of thinking about partnerships that are resilient to changing conditions through time. I don't know if you can say something about that.
Oh, wow. Okay. What are the key considerations for developing landscape restoration partnerships that are resilient to changing conditions over time? I don't know. That is a great question. I get Janet, feel free to chime in if you've got an answer on this. It's a very, very topical question at the moment, because if you think of a group like farmers working in the Lake District, they have to be resilient to changing conditions all the time, month to month, year to year, especially because they have to respond. So they have to respond and be so adaptable to something like changing support from the government, and in terms of agri-environment schemes. So there's been a lot of change with that recently. Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that question, but it is very, very topical, certainly in Cumbria.
I mean, is this something you would suggest projects could revisit through time? I mean, I know you sort of said it was focused at the early stages when people are kind of feeling each other out and getting to know each other, but is it something that maybe you could revisit and see how things change?
Yeah, I think potentially we haven't really considered what the value would be of doing these kind of processes later in a project. But yeah, there might be some way of trying to capture whether people's attitudes have changed over time. That would be a much bigger project that would involve collecting data at different people at different stages in projects. Yeah, there is definitely something in that. I think we like to think that in doing this work at an early stage, even like a pre-planning stage or just an early stage in a project, will foster, as I said, like a sense of curiosity and open-mindedness that I think are probably really key ingredients in making any project, including restoration projects, resilient to change over time. I guess because it makes it more likely that people will connect with each other, and that they will be interested in what other people have to say. They'll be more open to voicing their opinions because that level of trust is there. Yeah, and I think so hopefully that's something that can help projects become more resilient. And it's just reminded me that actually at the end of the workshops that we did in Bampton, we could see that there was connections being made informally between different kinds of stakeholders, including those the kind of people who said that they would have made assumptions about someone else in the room, and they were exchanging numbers and they were saying, let's talk further about this. I want to hear more about what you've got to say. That's probably a really important thing. That's improving the quality and the strength of connections between individuals in a project, even if it's in a very informal capacity. Hopefully that will make projects more resilient as well.
Great. Thanks for that interesting question, Alex. More to think about. I think that's a really nice place to leave it. Thank you so much, Annette. That was really fascinating. Thank you to everybody who came along and listened in. As we said, the resources should be available in the on the ELSP website, hopefully kind of early next year. Please do sign up to our news updates and you can get alerted about that. Brilliant. Thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.